Hi, Jim here, and you're listening to the Honest Filmmaker podcast, career advice from people in the business. This week on the podcast, I talked to production designer Phil Sims. Phil started off working in theatre and has gone on to work on some massive productions like Skyfall, The Last Jedi, Age of Ultron, and 2 Mission Impossible movies. I talked to Phil about how he got into the industry. We chatted about his first film project, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, his work on the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and also what it was like to work on huge productions like Mission Impossible and the challenges of integrating stunts into production design. Enjoy. So I'll start where I start with most people. Can you tell me how you started? Did you go to uni? Did you study? How did you get into the business?
Yeah, I studied theatre design at Central St Martin's in London, and after doing an art foundation course, and then stayed in London. I grew up in Derby and studied in Derby prior to that, and stayed in London from that point on really. And then after graduating, everything seemed clear in my mind that I wanted to be a theatre designer. So I was lucky enough to win a competition from my graduation show, and I was entered into another competition at the National Theatre, and thought, this is easy. I don't know what the fuss was about. Everybody told me this was going to be really complicated. I'd been in a theatre group, so I always I thought I wanted to be a theatre designer, but as a kid I was kind of obsessed with making of films and sci-fi films and sci-fi books and novels and things, comics and what have you. So I didn't really put films together with my career, or even TV, for sort of 4 years after leaving college, where I'd persevered to become a theatre designer, or an assistant theatre designer at least, and make models and what have you for different designers. And then some friends of mine from college set up a company to make props and sculpt and basically earn anything they could through creative means to pay the bills by working on TV shows and commercials. And at the time, there were lots of sort of Dorling and Kindersley DVDs, which nobody probably remembers now, but there were quite a lot of those, and we created a lot of content for those, lots of odd dinosaur props and skeletons and skulls and things. And that developed into art directing music videos. You hang around studios a lot, working in little workshops, meet lots of different people, and it gave us an opportunity to start art directing music videos, which was great fun. And I did that, and I had loads of fun doing that for probably 4 or 5 years, until that came to a natural conclusion, and we'd started to venture into commercials and TV documentaries and things, and it wasn't going to work much beyond that as a company. So we parted ways, and I had my first opportunity to work with Joel Collins and Dan May on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as an assistant art director. I met Frank Walsh there, who was the supervising art director. And once we'd finished Hitchhikers, my plan was actually to just do one film, see how everything had gone, see how people did it properly, because I felt like I'd been making it up as I went along for the last sort of 8 years, and go back and apply what I'd learned to commercials. And enjoyed it so much on film, and enjoyed the fact that relative to being a designer or an art director on commercials, I didn't have a lot of responsibility, but I was paid pretty well, and I could design and draw lots of sort of crazy things, and work with some amazing construction people, and just stuck to that really. And then woke up 20 years later and realised I'd been art directing for nearly 20 years or so in film, and I'd perhaps like to start designing things again, which has sort of brought me full circle to now. So then I went back. I did design something in 2016, which was a Black Mirror episode, again for Joel, and went back to supervise Mission Impossible 6, I think. That led into Mission Impossible 7 and Tom and Jerry, I think, which I supervised. And by the time those sort of movies had elapsed, I realised I really did want to try and design something. So then I went back to Well, actually, Joel came to me again, luckily for me, and asked me to do Doctor Who. So then I designed Doctor Who, which is what I've done for the last 3 years.
So started off wanting to do theatre, ended up in commercials, then
Yeah,
moved into film and just loved
yeah.
film so much. Why is film? Why have you not gone back to theatre?
I think honestly, what's taken me a long time to come to terms with is what I always kind of knew what I was good at, and I probably was overconfident about what I was good at. And one of the things I think you've got to be really good at as a designer, and certainly as a theatre designer who is very, very isolated and works in isolation quite a lot, is you've got to be on the front foot and dynamic and publicize yourself and be, very much a self publicist. And I've almost been the opposite of that my whole career, to the point, perhaps I'm now, I don't know, but that I'm more self deprecating. And those two things weren't natural bedfellows when you've got to pay the bills. If you're lucky enough to not have to worry for whatever reason that you have to pay the rent and all of that, and there aren't many people out there who are in that situation, I guess. Then you can, the jobs can be few and far between, and you can kind of remain, in inverted commas, a theatre designer or a production designer, any kind of designer probably, even though you're not producing lots of work, paid work for money. But as soon as that sort of career's got to pay the bills and got to pay its way, you need to look at it long and hard. And the truth is, theatre jobs are. I still love theatre to bits, but the design jobs were relatively low paid, and people do it for the love of it a lot of the time, certainly to start off with. And you might earn. I think my first theatre design job was, I had a fee of £1,500, and it was at least 3 months' work. So, I can't. I think my rent in London was £280 a month, which seems crazy now because it's the rent's extortionate in London now. But yeah, so it was very difficult to make ends meet, and the 3 months' work in principle was probably more like 4 or 5 months' work. And you'd need to then layer up jobs, so you'd need to work on 2, 3, 4 jobs at the same time, which, as I understand it, lots of successful theatre designers have to do and do. I've got a couple of friends who I was at college with who continued that career, but they've supplemented their income with other, whether they're teaching, whether they're doing more commercial projects, as well as the theatre or ballet or opera projects that they love. So, yeah, and I kind of reached the conclusion quite quickly that I wasn't going to earn enough money to buy a house, be secure, and so from that point of view, I probably sold out. Artistically, theatre. What I did love theatre creatively, and sold out until I realised, and I was kind of snobby about theatre. I thought theatre was a very pure way of designing something for performance. Having to design something over that works for an audience over a fixed period of time, over an hour or 2 hours or whatever the performance is, and the scenery develops and the costumes develop and everything happens more or less in front of your eyes. Obviously you can go off stage, but something's got to happen while that's going on. I thought that was very pure, and there was something fantastic about that. And I was a bit snobby about film and TV in that you can edit it, so of course you're going to get the best bit because you can just choose the best bit, and you point the camera at something very, very prescribed, more prescribed probably. Until I started doing it and realised that it's just as hard, but it's just a different discipline, and it's just as rewarding as well. And I love film and TV for in equal part now to theatre, probably because I get a real buzz out of the creativity.
Yeah, and also I imagine the camera probably picks up. It can get really close into stuff, can't it? And really pick every single detail out of a set and a prop. Whereas on theatre, it's kind of bam, you sort of see it, and things can be a little bit rougher, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a sort of there's a quality of theatre production probably that's led by budget as well, but you are always aware that there is, that there's the nearest point somebody can view your scenery from is, or the performance from is, I don't know, sometimes 10 meters away, maybe it's 5 meters away, but you're talking about, that sort of separation, and up to, someone sat in the gods, or, not miles away, but if it's an arena event, or, whatever. Notwithstanding, arena events now cross over, so you have you usually have a live video feed that's there to grass you up if you get it wrong, even if it works in a big sort of wide, from a wide point of view. Um, and yeah, the trick of TV, the thing that's hardest, I think, is, whatever project you're working on, the budget's limited. You have limited resources, as big or small as the project might be, and the trick of it is working out and being on the same page with everybody else, or inviting them to your page when necessary, to put the money on screen in the right place. And if you've got a detail, like you say, if you're shooting someone's a POV of someone's hand opening a lock, or a sci-fi widget on a wall, or they're using a weapon or a pen or something that you fabricated, you're going to see that in so much detail, arguably more detail than some of the huge sets that you might build. So it's doing that, and the danger is that the hardest thing is not having a blanket approach where you just try to finish everything to the nth degree and forever and ever in every direction, because nobody has those resources. So the trick is communication and understanding where the money needs to be spent. And sometimes, like you say, it might be on designing a new phone, or a particular mug, or a tankard from a period show, or a chair, a throne, and that you've got to have detail in it. You're going to film somebody in a close-up shot, a 50mm shot, and the chair might be 150mm behind the head, and it's going to be in detail. So you want it to look believably that it's been carved, or it's wood, or it's cast, and it's marble, or whatever it is. But the trick is not making every chair like that, or
I can imagine
every spot of the scenery.
Yeah. That reminds me of, and I'm just to double check before I mention this one. You didn't work on Force Awakens, did you?
No.
No. So have you seen the poster of Rey holding her stick?
Yeah.
Close up with the Phillips screwdriver. There's like a
no, you know what?
There's a Phillips screw on it. So does that stuff?
No, I've not seen that. Seen that. But if any of the team that I've been working with for the last 3 years are watching, it'll make them laugh, because the number of times I've kind of moaned about Phillips head screws in sets, and we've worked with an amazing team, and they are meticulous about hiding them, even if it's, at worst, it's with a blob of black tack. But ideally, you use different fixings that aren't Posi fixings or Phillips fixings. But the trouble is, we have to make creative decisions, right the way down to the wire when we're about to film something. And whatever the reason is, sometimes something's got to be fixed more or less in camera just before they turn over. And with the best will in the world, you don't always have time, or you can't, or you don't your plan isn't as good as you hope it is. You hope your plan's going to be bomb proof and there won't be a Phillips head screw in sight, unless it's a Phillips head screw commercial, I suppose, in which case you're off the hook, and maybe that's where we should all go and work. But yeah, sometimes we all get caught, and that's another level of creativity with TV and film, is the guys on standby, the standby art directors and the prop guys, have to be vigilant throughout that, and that's a whole different skill set. I find shoots ostensibly quite boring, if I'm perfectly honest with you. They start off brilliantly when you see your sets lit and you see the actors inhabit it and you see the shots that the DP and the director line up with. But day in, day out, kind of going over the same scenes um, and maintaining that level of vigil that you've got to, that really good standbys managed to do, is an art form in itself. To be ready on a sort of hair trigger to jump in, even though you may have had to do very little for the last 2 hours, I find it really hard. So yeah, there's all of those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm going to look for that Phillips screw now. That sounds great.
Yeah, and the thing is, you could also blame the person who did the poster, because it's a poster. So obviously they could have just photoshopped it out, but I think it just must have just squeaked by and everybody noticed it.
Yeah, and
afterwards.
if you speak to the prop master, I bet that whoever did the poster stuck that screw in deliberately in Photoshop just to wind everybody up, or just to see if people could spot it. So
Maybe,
yeah,
maybe.
there'll be all sorts of ways of looking at it, I'm sure.
So just to break it down for people who aren't familiar with doing your job, what's the difference between a production designer, an art director, and a supervising art director in the simplest terms you can explain it?
It can be about scale. So if you have a huge project, a huge movie, sometimes not a huge movie, but a movie where the art department is going to be quite a large team, and you need a level of delegation to get the amount of work done, and you also need a relationship and a direct line of communication with the director and the production team. Then those jobs are normally right at the top of the art department, and that's the production designer and the supervising art director's role. So the production designer is responsible for the look of the show and to maintain that the show is on budget. It's also the supervising art director's role. So the supervising art director is more in the nuts and bolts of that. So that the supervising art director will run the budget, usually with a construction manager, and liaise closely, sometimes manage the budget that overarches the props team and the set decoration team. That isn't always the case. On some movies, the set decoration team run their own budget, and that's a completely separate department. And the props team will run their own budget too. On a huge kind of Marvel show or Disney show, the amounts of money being spent aren't insignificant, and tracking all of those costs requires teams that understand the specifics of the requirements of those jobs and those departments. So you'll have somebody who's ostensibly accounting for the props, someone who's accounting for the set deck team and for the art department. But the supervising art director and the production designer are usually responsible to production for all of that. Even though there will be conversations between production and set decorators and prop masters independently to manage their budgets and their sets. Ultimately, it's really the production designer's responsibility to decide how much money is spent in set decoration versus construction, versus graphics and all the other sort of sub departments. An art director's role is usually to take responsibility for the drawing and the design of sets on behalf and in collaboration with the designer and the supervisor. So on the one hand, you'll have a conversation with the supervisor who say, how much is it costing? It's costing how much? We need to reduce costs, or I'm going to need to go and speak to production about that because we don't have those costs approved, and it's a new idea that's come up in a conversation with the director. So we need to make sure that everybody understands what we're doing. And though those processes sometimes involve having to go back to square one and rethink it, and sometimes they involve more money being allowed either within the budget of the art department and something else is sacrificed, or more money is allowed in the whole scheme of the production to facilitate that, because it might, building a bit more set might mean that there are fewer VFX shots. But that wasn't the plan from the onset. So it's about that kind of ongoing dialogue and communication with the production team and the accounts team. Right. A lot of art directors in the UK draw. So you'll have a lot of art directors in the UK draw sets and run a team of draftspeople and maybe have an assistant art director or two. In America, the system's a little bit different, where art directors don't draw. I'm not sure they draw at all, certainly not as prolifically as they do in the UK. It's not that it's prolific, but it's not an important part of their job. They're a manager, and an art director is a manager. Effectively, you're managing your middle management. You're managing the set construction. You're overseeing a set. You might be looking after a stage or two stages, or a backlot build. You might have an art director who's looking after several locations, where the locations have got to be prepared to look like a period street, or you've got to add rocks, trees, props, design elements to a location to be in sympathy with the location and to meet the designers and the director's requirements of that location.
So for the supervising and the production designer stuff, if you wanted to do that job, do you have to be good with numbers and calculating stuff? Are you good with that, or is that something you had to learn as you went into it, or is there someone stood next to you with a calculator going, yeah, you can have that, you can't have that?
The short answer is yes, it's useful if you're good with numbers. There will be someone sat with a calculator next to you in most cases, even if it's just to cross-check your calculations. I mean, most of our budgets are done through Excel. So, once you've done the job once and you've got a good Excel sheet set up, you can blanket at the end of that job and reinsert new set names and new set numbers, and it becomes kind of formulaic. And as I understand it, most supervisors would have more or less the same system, but they'll have their own way of implementing it, and their own way of presenting costs. But yeah, it's helpful if you can get your head around numbers. It's helpful if you've got your head around construction to a level, to a degree. None of them are prerequisites, though. You can become like any job, really, anywhere. You can become a supervising art director or even a designer because you're friends with someone who's one step above you in the process, or are in a sort of parallel part of the process. And although I was quite sort of dismissive of that and sort of thought it was all rather unfair at the start of my career, I just think go for it now. However you get a job, you've still got to stand there and do it. You've got to find your way through it. And I'd be telling fibs if I said that it isn't stressful sometimes and you don't have sleepless nights sometimes. And you've got to get through. Everybody's got to get through that, however they get through it. So I wish everybody the very best, however they get the jobs. But for me personally, it's been beneficial to be able to draw. Initially, the only thing I could do really coming out of school was drawing and making models and creatively making props or whatever I turned my hand to. And learning computer skills came later, but I think they're really important too in a modern art department.
Yeah. And so looking back at your early career, so doing your first big movie, which I'm assuming was something like Hitchhiker's Guide, what was that experience like? And is there anything on screen you recognise as, oh, I did that. That was my thing when you watched it?
My experience was, I can't believe we're paid to do this. Really, that was my takeaway. I genuinely had such a good time, and I got to design spaceships, which was a childhood dream. It was something I kind of probably talked myself out of ever being able to do on that scale. But the sets that I art directed were the Hog Pod, which is a round kind of Zaphod's runaround, basically. It's like a spherical Ferrari or something. And the Heart of Gold, which was the bigger spherical spaceship that Zaphod ran around the galaxy with.
We watched as a family. We watched Doctor Who. It's the first time the kids have watched a series of it. Loved it, and it looks. I don't know if I should say this, but it looks like it's had a lot of money spent on it. Like it looks like it's gone up a level. I mean, were you involved in previous seasons? Have you got any kind of understanding of, has it, or maybe it's the Disney effect, has it suddenly, because everything just looks bigger and glossier and fancier?
The show did have more money
Yeah.
than it had had previously, and I mean, from a point of view, but it didn't have massive movie money. You know, it
Yeah.
didn't have Star Wars Episode 9 money, or Star Wars Episode 7, or Star Wars Episode anything money,
Yeah.
really. Even
Yeah.
4, 5, and 6 back in the day, relative to the rate of inflation, we didn't
Yeah.
have those budgets either. So, but we had a more handsome budget than we'd had previously, than the show had had previously. I'd not worked on it prior to the Star Beast, which was the first of the new specials, and but yeah, we're cheating a bit. It's not very fair, you know, to compare sets and production values side by side is a little bit unfair in some cases. Although I did get the fear a few times, you know, I looked at some Matt Smith and the early David Tennant stuff, and some of the Jodie Whittaker stuff recently, and you watch an episode thinking, this is pretty good, you know, I don't know how they did this on the money. That's bonkers. So if people are able to look at ours and go, okay, well, they've done really good on the money, that would be great. I think there is an assumption that we've just had a huge injection of cash from Disney, and it's not really like that. You know, it's better. It was enough to do what we did, which hopefully looked great and everybody loved. So that's kind of the point. But could we have spent more? Oh yes.
I'm sure you could have. Yeah. So then, talking about the big stuff you've done. So Mission Impossible, what's that like, and how do you even do a project like that and integrate all stunts and things that obviously have an impact on production? How does it work, a big production like that?
I don't know. It's like an out of body experience, and I look back on it thinking, how did we do that? I don't know. I mean, I didn't design the Mission Impossibles. I was a supervising art director on Mission 6 and Mission 7, and there were different designers for both episodes. So Peter Wenham designed Episode 6, and Gary Freeman's designed 7, and he's designing 8 now. They're still, maybe they're finished. They're nearly finished. I think they're kind of still working on it. Both of whom are brilliant to work for. So the first thing I would say is you've got to have a brilliant team. You do have to have a bunch of people who are experienced and talented and get it, and have a even if you don't have an understanding of what you're getting into, because I don't think any of us did with Mission Impossible, you recognize it as early as possible to be able to make the best plan. And that sounds a bit cryptic probably, but Mission is made in a very creative way where, well, currently it's made in a very creative way. I don't know how it's always been made, but it's made in a very creative way where you don't really start off with a hard script. There's a notion, there's an idea, there's a feeling. There's usually an idea, or in my experience of the two movies I've worked on, there's an idea of the certain stunts that will be prominent, or you know, they'll be like tentpole stunts for the show. And you know, for Mission 6, that was a helicopter stunt that Tom was going to fly by himself. And for Mission 7, we were going to throw, drive, eject an actual locomotive off a cliff, for real. So they were two of our starting points. They were two of our they were known in that there was an ambition to do both, but they weren't known in terms of how that happened and how it broke down and how the different roles that were required were put into place. None of that was known at the beginning. And certainly how big a part they were in the show wasn't really known, and how story-wise and plot-wise they were going to be wrapped up and entwined and linked together and all of that. We didn't really know that either. So they were scary. I can't pretend. Mission Impossible 6 was a scary process for me, to be asked very early on to provide a budget for a show that you didn't actually have a script for is different. You know, it's quite interesting. And of course, you can't really do it with any accuracy. All you can do is draw on the experience you have, how much, you know, because there is a kind of, broadly, I suppose, certainly with, you know, like Marvel shows and shows we've become accustomed to in recent years, they're almost like operas. You know, there's a first act, second act, third act, and the third act probably won't be cheap, and and you don't always know what the third act's going to be, even on a movie with a script. You know, you might have a notion of the third act, but it's not finalised, or it gets rewritten, and that's part of the ongoing process. But you've at least got 2 acts to really get your teeth stuck into. But with Mission, that's not the case. So with Mission 6, for instance, the goal initially, or the directive, was to find as many cool looking locations as we could. And then, you know, the designer creatively then kind of looks at locations with a view to, you know, every film you've ever seen, and also the films you'd like to see, you know, the things you would love to see, the things that you think would be dramatic and brilliant and huge. And then, you know, pitch those to the production team and see how that works, and see which ones get traction and see which don't. And then, you know, on the back of those conversations, the writers or the director or DPs, Tom, will have ideas about what would be cool, you know, what would be great, what's not been seen, what would be exciting or dramatic. And that then leads to another idea. But you know, from, as you can understand from the process I'm talking about, it's quite slow. You know, that it's quite a slow process to go through when you're sitting within a conventional film production timeline, but you've got to find the script. You've got to find it. Almost, it's not improvisation, but the closest I could imagine, in a way, is that you're, you know, when theatre pieces are improvised, and or movies are improvised, and then the you know, the bits that work and the relationships that work and the characters that develop and all that kind of thing is drawn upon. Well, Mission's kind of made like that, but there are huge, kick-ass, expensive stunts punctuated through the process, and often you know, as a filmmaker, you kind of know there are shortcuts. You kind of understand when you read a script that, well, that's probably a close-up, so we might not need a huge piece of scenery. That's probably a wide, so there's an argument it's going to be visual effects at some point, because there'll be a trade-off financially, that it's more it's cheaper to do it in visual effects, or more expedient. Mission doesn't have many of those conversations. There's a reluctance to commit to visual effects, certainly early in the process. So the idea is that if you film it for real and you get it for real and Tom's in the frame, the audience will be with you and they'll be right alongside and believe it, and be engaged in the movie. And although I would have argued that maybe not the case when I started, I think there's something in it. I mean, whether it's cost effective and whether it's, you know, the most prudent way to make movies, I don't know. I mean, I guess if it was, everybody would be doing it, and they're not. So it might not be the case, but there is an energy that comes from it, and there's a kind of some part of the process is captured in the sort of edit that's put together, and I can't deny that. You know, after being through the process and seeing the final product, they definitely have something. There's something to be said for that. But it's difficult. You know, we went to Paris on Mission 6 to shoot the Parisian elements, which we'd we'd managed to use all of our prep time to work out, what was required and where we were going to be and which locations looked cool and how big and how long we could have the locations for. We could go to the Grand Palais. Everybody loved the Grand Palais. That was brilliant. But then we could only have the Grand Palais for a total of something like 14 days. Obviously, the production would have loved to shoot every single day that we were in there, but of course you can't, because you've got to get out of it and leave the place as you found it. You've got to get into it and install any sets and special effects and stunt rigs that you're going to need for the stunts required. The ambition was to create the stunts for real on the roof of the Grand Palais, so we have to ask all of those questions, even though in your filmmaker brain is sort of saying you're never going to do that. You are never going to do that. The French authorities will never allow that. And then, of course, you end up building a roof on the back lot in Leavesden so we can do those stunts and that sort of thing. But asking that question at every stage of the process does elicit the unexpected sometimes. And it does mean that every now and then someone says, yeah, that's okay, you can do that. And we all sort of gawp at each other for a bit, saying, I didn't expect them to say that. And then you get on with it and process it. They're kind of fierce. Tom's passion is fierce. Not in a nasty way, but he's just passionate about the work that he does. And he's a real motivational force to make things happen. Sometimes the unexpected happens, and sometimes it doesn't, and you default to your experience and end up making things the way you thought you might make it months ago, but with the added information of specifically what's required. Whereas at the beginning you were just guessing at it. Yeah. So they're tricky. Mission Impossibles are tricky.
Yeah, that sounds like headache.
I think they're tricky. Yeah.
But yeah, like you say, on paper, that sounds horrendous, not knowing what's happening and just going, we're going to do these big stunts and then we're going to do that, make the budget for it. That sounds horrendous.
Yeah.
But like you say, that there is that Tom Cruise effect that just seems to happen. And when you watch them, they're so energetic and so big that I guess, like you say, the magic's there. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you'd like to hear from more industry professionals, how they got into the business and how you can do the same, or you just want to listen to some cool stories from movie sets around the world, then please do subscribe to the Honest Filmmaker podcast.